Chapter 1. The Man in Room 34. The iron gates of Blackthorn Asylum loomed in the mist, their towering presence a silent warning to all who entered. Beyond them, the asylum stretched like a hollow skeleton against the storm-lit sky, gray stone. Walls, barred windows, and corridors steeped in whispers. It was a place where the lost were locked away, where society's unwanted were forgotten. Clara Hawthorne had been here for a year, long enough to hear the cries echo through the halls at night, long enough to understand that not all patients were mad, some were merely inconvenient. And yet, she had never questioned her place here. She was a nurse, sworn to duty, bound by the laws of medicine and morality. Until the night she stepped into room 34. She had been warned about him. "Stay away from that one," the other nurses whispered. "He's dangerous, delusional, thinks himself a genius, an artist of the mind. But his words will get inside your head if you let them." His name was Victor LaSalle, a man with a past so shrouded in mystery that even the doctors avoided speaking of it. Some said he was once a celebrated scholar, others a poet with a mind, so brilliant it had burned him from the inside out. Whatever the truth was, Clara had no reason to fear him. She had tended to the violent ones before, those who screamed and clawed, who wept and raged. LaSalle was not like them. He sat in the far corner of his cell, bathed in the cold glow of the moon filtering through the barred window. His hair, black as a raven's wing, curled against his forehead, damp from the rain that seeped through the cracks in the ceiling. His white asylum shirt was slightly unbuttoned, revealing the sharp lines of his collarbone, the tension in his throat as he breathed. And then, he turned. His eyes, dark, knowing, locked onto hers. And for a fleeting moment, Clara forgot where she was. His gaze held none of the wild madness she had come to expect. It was piercing, assessing, as if he were peeling away her layers, seeing straight into the heart of her. "You're new," he murmured, his voice rich and smooth, tinged with something dangerous. She straightened, gripping the tray in her hands. "I've been here a year," he smirked. "Then why have I never seen you before?" She hated the way her pulse quickened at that. Ignoring him, she stepped forward and set the tray on the small wooden table beside his bed. Bread, water, a small bowl of stew. He watched her every movement, his head tilting slightly, studying her. "Tell me, nurse," he said softly, "do you believe I belong here?" She stiffened. It was an old game, one she had learned well. Many patients claimed they weren't mad, that they had been wrongly imprisoned. Most were lying. But something in Victor's tone unsettled her. "Don't make those judgments," she said, keeping her voice professional. "I only care for the patients." He laughed, low and almost intimate, as if she had just said something amusing. "Ah, but caring requires knowing, doesn't it? You tend to their wounds, to their fevers. But what about their minds? Do you truly know any of them?" Clara's breath hitched as he stood. He moved slowly, purposefully, closing the distance between them. He was tall, too tall, his presence overwhelming in the small room. The air between them grew thick, charged with something unspoken, something that sent a shiver down her spine. "You should be careful, nurse," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place has a way of making sane people question themselves." Clara forced herself to hold her ground, lifting her chin. "Eat your food, Mr. LaSalle." His lips quirked at the corner, as if he found her defiance delightful. He did not touch the food. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, his dark eyes never leaving hers. And then, he smiled. A slow, knowing thing that made her stomach tighten, as if he already knew she would return to him. Chapter 2. The warning. Clara left room 34 with her heart hammering in her chest. The echo of Victor LaSalle's gaze followed her down the dimly lit hallway, lingering like a shadow. She told herself it was nothing, a patient's mind games, a dangerous man weaving dangerous words. And yet, her hands trembled as she returned the tray to the kitchen. "You went in there, didn't you?" Nurse Abigail's voice came from behind, soft but urgent. She stood with her arms crossed, her face drawn tight, into LaSalle's room. Clara nodded, keeping her voice even. "He's still a patient. He needs care like the others." Abigail's eyes darted, as if she were afraid of being overheard. "He's not like the others, Clara. They say he was committed not for madness, but for something worse, something unspeakable." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" But Abigail only shook her head. "Just stay away from him, for your own good." That night, Clara lay awake in her narrow bed, listening to the groan of the old walls and the distant cries that came with every storm. But louder than that was Victor's voice, playing in her mind. "Do you believe I belong here?" She didn't know. But when she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the sharp lines of his jaw, the dark, watchful gaze that felt as though it could unearth every secret she'd ever buried. And it terrified her how much that thought excited her. The next day, she tried to avoid him. She made her rounds with quick steps and downcast eyes, focusing on the routine, the safety of tasks. She told herself that if she didn't return to room 34, the strange tension would fade. But by nightfall, as she passed the heavy door, her steps faltered, and then she heard, "It, nurse." His voice was a thread of silk, sliding through the crack beneath the door, wrapping itself around her, drawing her in. She should have walked on. She should have kept moving, left him to the dark. But her hand was already reaching for the handle. Victor sat on the bed, his posture relaxed, as though he'd been waiting. His dark eyes met hers and didn't let go. "I wondered if you'd come," he said, his lips curving into that slow, dangerous smile. I only came to check on you." Clara hated how unsure her voice sounded. She hated the way her heart betrayed her, skipping like a stone across water. He stood, the simple movement sending a ripple of tension through the air. His height, his presence, filled the small room, pressing in close. "You shouldn't be here," he said, though his gaze didn't waver. "It's dangerous." "For me?" she asked, though she wasn't sure if it was defiance or curiosity that made her ask. "For both of us." His voice was soft, but it held an edge, something sharp beneath the surface. And then he stepped closer, so near she could feel the warmth of his breath. She could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the darkness in his eyes. "Why do you come, Clara?" he whispered, her name falling from his lips like a secret. "To care for me? Or to see how far you'll let me push you?" Clara swallowed hard, her body tense, her pulse betraying her calm facade. "I'm only here to help." But Victor smiled, slowly, darkly. "I think you're here because you want me to ruin you." The words sent a bolt of heat through her, sharp and dizzying. Her breath caught, but she refused to move, to let him see how deeply the words struck. And still, she didn't leave, because he was right. Somehow, she wanted him to ruin her. Chapter 3. The Confession. The night air pressed heavy against the asylum walls, whispering secrets in the dark. Clara stood by the window long after her shift ended, staring out at the gardens that lay still beneath the moon. She told herself she wouldn't go back to him, wouldn't let him pull her deeper into the web of his words and the shadow of his gaze. But when morning came, her feet found their way back to room 34. Victor sat on the edge of his bed, hands clasped, his head tilted as though he'd known. She would come. "You dream of me," he said without greeting. "Don't you?" Clara's breath caught. She hated how he said it, as though her heart was something fragile he could hold in his hand. "You're mistaken," she said, her voice low. But Victor only smiled, slow and dangerous. "And yet, you're here." He stood and crossed the room, stopping inches from her. Close enough that she could feel his warmth, could sense the tension vibrating off him like heat. "You shouldn't be," he whispered, his gaze flickering over her face, lingering on her lips. "But you want to be." "Why?" Clara's breath trembled, but she refused to look away. "I don't know." Victor's hand lifted slowly, but he didn't touch her. His fingers hovered near her cheek, close enough that she could almost feel the phantom brush of his skin. "I think you do," he murmured. And then he stepped back, his withdrawal sudden, sharp, like tearing silk. "Go," he said. His voice was low, dangerous. "Before I forget what little control I have left." Chapter 4. The warning, the next day, the whispers began, soft and sharp, like knives behind Clara's back. She spends too much time in his room. She's too soft on him, too close. She'll lose herself if she's not careful. Abigail found her by the kitchen door, her face pale. "You need to be careful. He's dangerous, Clara. There are rumors about why he's here, about the women he's hurt before. Don't think you're different." Clara wanted to argue, but the words caught in her throat. Was she different? Or just another woman waiting to be broken? That night, as she lay in bed, she heard footsteps outside her door. Slow, measured, a shadow beneath the crack. And then a voice, soft as sin. "Dream of me, Clara." Chapter 5. The fall. She didn't mean to go to him. She told herself she wouldn't. But her body betrayed her. Her heart. Her desire. Room 34 was dark when she slipped inside. Victor stood by the window, his back to her, bare arms crossed over, his chest. The moonlight traced the sharp cut of his shoulders, the tension in his posture. He didn't turn when he spoke. "I told you not to come." "I know." "Then why are you here?" His voice was a low, dangerous whisper. Clara's hands trembled at her sides. She didn't have the words, only the need that burned beneath her skin. Victor turned slowly, his gaze shadowed but burning. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said. But he stepped closer. Close enough that his breath stirred the hair against her cheek. "Maybe I do," she whispered. And then his hand was on her face, fingers trembling as though he fought himself. His thumb traced the curve of her jaw, and his mouth hovered near hers, close enough that she could taste the heat of him. "I will ruin you," he said. The words were a promise, a threat. Clara's heart pounded. "Then do it." His restraint broke. His lips captured hers, fierce and demanding, tasting of longing and danger. His hand slid into her hair, holding her close, as though afraid she would vanish. Clara pressed into him, her hands tangling in his shirt. She didn't care about rules, or whispers, or the darkness that lingered beneath his skin. She cared only about this, about him. When he pulled back, his breath was ragged. His eyes burned. "Say it," he demanded. "Say you're mine." "I'm yours," she gasped, the words torn from her lips like a confession. Victor's forehead pressed to hers, his body trembling. "You don't know what that means, but you will." Chapter 6. The secret. The morning after, Clara felt the weight of what had happened pressing against her skin. Her lips still burned from his kiss, her heart from the confession she'd whispered in the dark. But reality was cruel. It waited for her beyond the shadows of room 34. In the hallway, Dr. Whitmore's gaze lingered too long. "You're pale, Miss Clark. Everything all right?" Clara forced a smile. "Just tired." But the doctor's eyes were sharp, calculating, watching her too closely. Later, while tending the gardens, Abigail pulled Clara aside. "You're not safe," she hissed. "He's dangerous, Clara. You don't know what he's done." Clara's hands trembled. "What do you mean? But—" Abigail shook her head. "You need to stay away, for your own good." And yet, that night, Clara found herself outside room 34 once again, drawn like a moth to the flame. Victor stood waiting, as though he'd known she would come, his eyes dark, haunted. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Then why are you waiting for me?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, fingers ghosting over her wrist. His touch was fire, his gaze a trap. "You don't know what they've told you, but I'm not the monster they think I am." "Then tell me the truth," she whispered. Victor's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't believe it." Chapter 7. The Past Unveiled. The truth came in fragments, shards of memories Victor shared in the dead of night. A woman, a scandal, a death he swore wasn't his fault. "They said I killed her," he said, voice raw. "But I didn't. I loved her. I tried to save her." Clara wanted to believe him, needed to, but the shadow of doubt coiled deep within her. "Why won't they let you leave?" she asked. Victor's gaze turned distant. "Because dead women can't speak, and I was the only one left." The words chilled her, but still, she didn't run. She stayed. And that night, when he kissed her again, it was softer, slower. But beneath the tenderness was a hunger that terrified her. Chapter 8. The betrayal. Clara wasn't the only one who noticed. Whispers turned to accusations. Dr. Whitmore summoned her to his office. The heavy oak door shut behind her with a final thud. "You're getting too close, Miss Clark," he said coldly. "You forget your place." Clara's heart raced. "I'm just doing my duty." But the doctor's gaze was sharp, cruel. "Your duty isn't to tempt dangerous men. You'll be reassigned." Panic shot through her. Reassigned meant being sent far from Victor, far from the truth. That night she went to him, told him everything. "They want to separate us," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. Victor's expression darkened. "They're afraid of what you'll learn." "What do I do?" He stepped closer, cupping her face, his touch trembling. "Run with me." The words stole her breath. "Victor, leave this place, tonight, with me." Clara's heart thundered. Fear and longing warred within her. But when she looked into his eyes, the decision was already made. Chapter 9. The Escape. The air in the asylum felt heavier that night, thick with unsaid words and fear. Clara's hands trembled as she packed. A small satchel, only the bare essentials. A cloak, a loaf of bread, the worn locket her mother had given her. Victor waited in the shadows by the garden wall, his figure barely distinguishable against the night. His eyes gleamed when he saw her approach, though worry clouded their depths. "Are you sure?" he whispered. His hand brushed hers, steadying her, grounding her. She nodded, though fear gnawed at her. "I can't stay here. Not without you." Victor's lips curved into something almost tender. "Then we go. Together." They slipped into the darkness, past the guards, their footsteps light, hearts pounding louder than any footsteps could. Clara's breath hitched as they passed Dr. Whitmore's office. She could almost feel his gaze, even in sleep. But the world outside was colder than she remembered. Unforgiving. They ran through the woods, the trees whispering like sentinels of old, their shadows deep and looming. Victor pulled her close, his hand firm around her wrist. "We'll be safe soon, I promise." But promises were fragile things. Behind them, a shout, flashing lights. "They've seen us," Clara gasped, fear lacing her words. Victor's jaw tightened. "Run, Clara, don't stop." But her feet felt heavy, the ground a snare beneath her. She stumbled, and his hands caught her, holding her so tightly it hurt. "I won't let them take you from me," he said, voice low, fierce. They ran until their lungs burned, until the world blurred, and the only sound was the pulse of blood in her ears. Finally, they found shelter, a hollow beneath an old oak tree. They huddled together, breathless, shadows merging into one. Clara pressed her face against his chest, feeling the frantic beat of his heart. "Will they find us?" Victor's fingers brushed through her hair, slow and comforting. "Not tonight. Tonight we're safe." But when his lips found hers, it wasn't safety he offered. It was a promise of something deeper, something that bound her to him in ways no walls or chains ever could. And for the first time, Clara realized that escape wasn't just from the asylum. It was from herself. From the part of her that still feared loving a man like Victor. Beneath the ancient oak, the night wrapped around them like a secret. The danger had retreated for now, leaving only the echo of their shared breaths. Clara's heart thundered beneath her ribs, though she couldn't tell if it was from fear or from the way Victor held her, his hands warm and steady. His fingers traced her jaw, gentle, as though memorizing her face in the darkness. His touch was reverent, and yet there was hunger beneath it, a longing that trembled between them like a string drawn tight. "Clara," he whispered, her name a prayer and a question. She met his gaze. Her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat. She knew what lingered in his eyes. She felt it mirrored in her own heart. Not just desire, but the need to be seen, to be understood, to be his, and she wanted it. She wanted him. She answered without words, her lips seeking his. Their mouths met in a slow, deep kiss, one that unfurled like fire, consuming the fear, the uncertainty, the past. His hands slid to her waist, steadying her, holding her as though she was something fragile, precious. When his lips broke from hers, they traced a path along her cheek, down her neck, slow and savoring. She tilted her head, allowing him closer, her hands fisting in his shirt. The fabric was rough beneath her fingers, a sharp contrast to the warmth of his skin as she slid her hands beneath the hem, feeling the strength of him beneath her touch. Victor's breath was ragged as he pulled back, searching her eyes. "Tell me to stop, Clara, if you want me to." But she didn't. She shook her head, her hands reaching for him, pulling him back, whispering his name as though it was the answer to every question. Clothes fell away beneath the cover of shadows, slow and hesitant, and then eager. Their bodies pressed together, heat meeting heat, skin brushing skin. Every movement was a question, every touch an answer. He laid her gently against the moss-covered earth, his hands moving with care, learning every curve, every sigh. Her fingers traced the sharp lines of his jaw, the strong slope of his shoulders. She memorized him as he did her, mapping his body with delicate reverence. When they became one, it was with tenderness, slow, deep, and consuming. The world fell away, leaving only the two of them, tangled beneath the stars, their bodies moving in rhythm, as though they'd been waiting for this moment all their lives. It was not rushed. It was not harsh. It was surrender. And when it was over, when they lay entwined beneath the oak, their bodies slick with warmth, their hearts beating in tandem, Clara pressed her hand to his chest, feeling the steady thrum beneath her fingers. "You're mine now," Victor whispered, his voice rough against the softness of the night. "And I am yours." She nodded, too full to speak, and laid her head against him. And though the world beyond the forest loomed dark and dangerous, in that moment, beneath the oak, they were safe. They were free. Chapter 10. Shadows of truth. The morning came too soon, golden light piercing through the branches of the oak, casting dappled patterns across Clara's skin. Victor lay awake beside her, his arm draped protectively over her waist, holding her close as though the night had not been enough to seal their bond. But dawn brought with it reality. The world beyond the forest was still waiting for them. Dangerous and cruel. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open, meeting his gaze. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, neither ready to break the fragile peace of their night. But the tension lingered, heavy, inevitable. "We can't stay here," she whispered, brushing a hand against his chest. Victor's jaw tightened. "I know." He sat up, his eyes scanning the trees, alert. "But wherever we go, they'll be searching for us. They'll hunt us down." Clara pulled her clothes close, the chill of the morning air biting against her skin. But it wasn't just the cold that made her shiver. It was the fear that this moment, this freedom, was already slipping through her fingers. "We'll find a way," she said, trying to sound stronger than she felt. "We always do." Victor looked at her, his gaze softening. "You give me more strength than you know, Clara." But even strength might not be enough. They moved quickly, following the river deeper, into the woods, hoping to mask their trail. The deeper they went, the heavier the silence became. Only the sound of their footsteps, the whisper of water against rocks, and the distant cry of birds. But by midday, they heard the unmistakable crunch of boots behind them. Victor's hand shot out, pulling Clara behind a thicket of trees. His body pressed close to hers, shielding her, his eyes sharp and searching. Through the gaps, they saw soldiers, 4 men, blades glinting in the sunlight, their faces hard and cruel. Clara's heart thudded painfully. She clenched her hands into fists, willing her body to be still, to be silent. But the inevitable came fast. One of the soldiers caught sight of something, an overturned stone, a print of a boot in the mud. He barked orders, and the group turned, eyes scanning the trees. Victor's breath was hot against her ear as he whispered, "Run, Clara. If they find me, they'll kill me. If they find you..." His jaw tightened. "You can't be caught." "No," she hissed, her hand clutching his. "I won't. Leave you? You must." His eyes burned into hers, fierce and pained. "Please." But it was too late. A branch snapped beneath Victor's foot, and a soldier turned. Eyes met. A shout tore through the forest, and chaos erupted. Victor shoved Clara aside. "Go!" he yelled, even as he threw himself toward the nearest soldier, tackling him to the ground. Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, but then she ran, her legs burning, her heart breaking. The sounds of battle echoed behind her. Clashing steel, sharp cries, Victor's voice, then a scream. A voice cut off too soon. Clara stumbled to a stop, torn between fear and love. She turned, just in time to see Victor fall, blood blooming across his side. "No!" she screamed, running back. But it was too late. The soldiers were upon him, and though he fought like a man possessed, his strength faltered. A blade caught him again, and he dropped, motionless, The world blurred, her scream echoing through the trees as she rushed toward him. But strong hands caught her from behind, dragging her back. She kicked and clawed, sobbing his name. "He's dead, girl," the soldier sneered. "Run, and maybe you'll live." But she didn't run. She dropped beside him, her hands shaking as she pressed against his wound. Blood, warm and thick, coated her fingers. His eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused. "Clara," he rasped. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Stay with me, please, Victor. Don't leave me." But his eyes slid closed, and darkness took him. When Clara woke, days had passed. She was in a grand room, soft velvet curtains drawn closed, the air heavy with the scent of herbs and smoke. Panic surged as memories slammed into her, but then a hand reached for hers, warm and trembling. Victor, alive. His face was pale, but his eyes opened, meeting hers. There was pain there, but there was life too. "You wanted me dead, didn't you?" His voice was hoarse but teasing. "And yet here you are crying over me." Clara choked out a laugh, tears falling freely. "I thought I'd lost you." "You can't lose me," he murmured, squeezing her hand. "Not now." She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered, and he smiled. "Then I have every reason to fight." Chapter 11. Bonds of Recovery. The days passed slowly, a haze of pain and hope. Victor lay weak, the wound in his side healing under Clara's constant care. She never left his side, tending to him with gentle hands, whispering soft words to keep him anchored to life. The kingdom outside bustled, unaware of the battle that raged within their small world. "You should rest," Victor murmured one evening, his voice still raw, though his strength was returning little by little. His hand found hers, fingers weak but warm. Clara shook her head, brushing damp hair from his brow. "I'll rest when you do." His eyes traced her face, lingering on the dark circles beneath her eyes. "I'm sorry, Clara, that you had to see me like this, that you suffered because of me." She leaned closer, her forehead pressing softly to his. "Don't. You fought for me. You lived for me." Her voice trembled. "I would endure 1,000 nights like that if it meant saving you." A breath of silence stretched between them, heavy with words left unspoken. Victor's thumb brushed along her wrist, tracing her pulse. "You saved me more than once, Clara. Not just from death, but from the man I thought I had to be." As the days wore on, Victor regained strength. Each step he took was slow, painful, but with Clara's arm beneath his, he pushed forward. His men had moved them to the heart of the kingdom, ensuring his protection. Yet shadows lingered, enemies still lurked, and secrets were heavy in the air. Clara sensed it, the way the guards watched them, the quiet whispers when they passed. But Victor focused only on her. One evening, as twilight bathed the kingdom in gold, Victor walked with her in the gardens. His arm was steadier now, his grip stronger. "These walls," he said quietly, "they remind me of my weakness, that even strength can falter." Clara turned to him. "And love makes you stronger." He paused, his eyes darkening, fixed on her. "And you, Clara, are the only strength I need." Later that night, Clara sat beside the window, staring out into the moonlit gardens. Her mind wandered, fears of the future, memories of the attack, the shadow of nearly losing him. Victor's voice broke. Her thoughts. "You should sleep," he said softly, leaning against the doorway. His face, though still pale, carried a quiet determination. Clara stood, walking to him. She touched his face gently, her fingers lingering on the line of his jaw. "Only if you stay." He smiled, though sadness lingered in his eyes. "Always." That night, they lay together, not in desperation, but in quiet understanding. Their fingers twined, their breaths mingled. It wasn't the fierce passion of fear, but the deeper intimacy of survival, of knowing how close they had come to losing it all. "I thought I'd lost you," Clara whispered against his chest. Victor's arms tightened around her. "You'll never lose me." And in the dark, beneath the canopy of velvet sheets, they found comfort, not in passion, but in presence. In love that had survived fire and fear. Chapter 12. Shadows Within the Walls. Victor's recovery marked the beginning of a new chapter, but peace was elusive. Whispers echoed through the marble halls, and eyes lingered too long when Clara passed. There were enemies still, not on the battlefield, but within the walls of the kingdom. One morning, Victor summoned his most trusted men. They gathered in the dim war room, their faces sharp with concern. Clara watched from the doorway, feeling the tension coil around them. "There is a traitor among us," Victor said quietly, his voice steady though still hoarse from recovery. "Someone who knew our camp's location, someone who wanted me dead." A chill ran down Clara's spine. She stepped closer. "Do you know who it is?" Victor's gaze met hers, unreadable. "Not yet, but I will." Later that day, Clara walked through the gardens, her mind spinning. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking in every shadow. "You're uneasy." Victor's voice startled her. He stepped beside her, his presence grounding but heavy. "Someone betrayed you," she whispered. "And I don't know who I can trust." Victor turned to her, his hand brushing against hers. "You can trust me." "I know," she said softly, "but I worry for you. If they tried once, they'll try again." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then let them try. I'll be ready." But danger wasn't always cloaked in swords and steel. It came with words, too. Poisonous whispers meant to erode trust. That evening, as Clara passed through the great hall, she overheard the quiet murmur of guards. "She's the reason he's weak." He was stronger before her. If he falls, it will be because of her. Clara froze, her pulse quickening. But Victor appeared behind her, his steps silent. He heard it too. Without hesitation, his voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. "If anyone doubts her, they doubt me." The hall fell silent. The men turned, their faces pale. Victor's gaze burned. "And if anyone dares to speak ill of her again, they will answer to my sword." Clara's breath caught, not because of fear, but the fierce protection in his words, the way he stood for her, even against his own men. He turned to her, his eyes softer. "You are my strength, Clara. Don't ever let them make you doubt it." But that night, when the candles burned low and shadows grew thick, Clara lay awake. Victor's words echoed in her mind, but so did the whispers of doubt. And deep down, she wondered, was love enough to survive the darkness that lingered in the corners of their world? Chapter 13. The Traitor Revealed. The morning broke with an uneasy silence. Clouds hung low over the castle, and the air felt thick with an unnamed tension. Clara awoke to find Victor already gone, summoned to the war room. She dressed quickly, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. When she reached the great hall, whispers greeted her. Tense faces, eyes cast downward. Something had happened. Victor stood at the head of the room, his jaw clenched, eyes cold as steel. Beside him, 2 guards restrained a man, Sir Edric, one of Victor's most trusted advisors. Clara gasped, her fingers trembling against her skirts. "Tell her," Victor ordered, his voice sharp as a blade. Edric's face was pale, twisted with fury and shame. "It was me," he spat. "I gave them the camp's location. I wanted you dead, Victor. I wanted her gone." Clara's breath caught. "Why?" she whispered. His eyes burned into hers, filled with hate. "Because you made him weak. You turned him into a man ruled by his heart, not his sword. I did it for the kingdom, for strength." Silence fell, heavy and suffocating. Clara looked to Victor, but his face was carved from stone, unreadable. "You betrayed me," Victor said, his voice low and dangerous. "And you tried to kill the woman I love." Clara's heart pounded. Love. He had never said it so plainly before, never spoken the word aloud. Edric sneered. "She will be your downfall." Victor stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the stone floor. "No, she is my salvation." And, without another word, he nodded to the guards. They dragged Edric away, his curses echoing through the hall. Later, Clara found Victor standing by the window, his gaze distant, troubled. She approached quietly, her hand brushing his arm. "You said you loved me." Her voice was soft, uncertain. He turned, his eyes shadowed. "I do." "Then why do you look so lost?" she asked. He sighed, his hand covering hers. "Because I trusted him. I fought beside him, and he tried to destroy us." Clara's throat tightened. "You did nothing wrong." He looked down at her, pain flickering. In his gaze, "I did. I let my guard down. I let love make me vulnerable." "And would you take it back?" she whispered. Silence, heavy, tense. Then, "No," he said, voice rough. "Never." That night, their love felt fragile but fierce. Victor held Clara close, as if afraid the world might tear her from his arms, and she clung to him, knowing now how close they had come to losing everything. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. And in the shadows of the kingdom, Clara knew darkness still waited. Chapter 14. Shadows of the past, the days that followed were heavy with decisions. Edric's betrayal had left wounds deeper than flesh, and the court buzzed with whispers of doubt. Yet, Victor stood firm, his loyalty to Clara declared before all. But trust was fragile, and the past had a way of lingering. One afternoon, Clara walked through the gardens, her thoughts tangled with worry. She found Victor beneath the ancient oak, the place where their love had first ignited. His back was to her, broad and tense. "You're troubled," she said gently. He turned, his eyes shadowed. "The court is divided. Some see you as my weakness, others as my strength. I cannot protect you from their judgment." Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing his. "I don't need protection from words, only from losing you." Victor's gaze softened, but pain still lingered. "They will always find reasons to doubt you, to tear you down." "Then let them," she said, lifting her chin. "Let them try. I have survived worse than their whispers." Victor smiled faintly, pride flickering in his eyes. "You are braver than I." "No," Clara whispered, "just as stubborn." That night, they stood before the court. Clara's hand in Victor's, her spine straight, her gaze fierce. "I stand with him," she declared. "And if any doubt my place here, let them challenge me now." Silence fell, heavy, thick, and no one stepped forward. The battle was won without bloodshed, but Clara knew the war was deeper, within hearts, within trust. Later, in the quiet of their chambers, Victor kissed her, slow and deep, as if sealing a vow not with words, but with flesh. "I would lose kingdoms for you," he murmured against her lips, "and I would follow you into ruin," she breathed back. But ruin was not what awaited them, for the next day brought news of distant enemies gathering, of a war yet to come, but they were ready. Together. Chapter 15. The final dawn. The horizon burned with the orange glow of an approaching storm, not of rain, but of war. Victor stood upon the ramparts, his gaze fixed on the distant banners rising in the wind. The enemy was near, and the kingdom trembled beneath the weight of impending battle. Behind him, Clara approached, her steps quiet, yet sure. She had shed the fragility of her past. Now, she stood as a queen beside her king, strong, fierce, unyielding. "You don't have to fight," she said, though her voice betrayed no fear. "You could leave, run. We could be free." Victor turned, his expression softening at the sight of her. "There is no freedom in running, only in facing what hunts us." Clara stepped closer, reaching for his hand. "Then we face it together." The battle, the clash of steel rang through the air. Blood stained the earth beneath their feet. Victor led his men with unwavering ferocity, his sword flashing like silver lightning. But it was Clara who turned the tide. Her courage burned brighter than any flame, her voice a rallying cry that stirred the hearts of warriors. She stood not behind Victor, but beside him. And when the enemy king fell beneath Victor's blade, the field fell silent. It was over. Victory was theirs. Aftermath. In the quiet of the aftermath, Clara stood by the oak tree, the place that had witnessed their love and their trials. Victor approached, his steps slow, his face shadowed by exhaustion and relief. "You saved me," he said, voice raw. "More times than I can count." She turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "And you saved me, long before this battle." Victor reached for her, his hand steady despite the tremble in his heart. "There will be no more running, no more hiding, only us." He fell to one knee, his sword laid at her feet. "Clara, will you be my queen, not just in name, but in every breath, every moment, every war we face together?" Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice was strong. "I already am." Epilogue. Months later, the castle sang with the joy of their union. The people cheered, banners flew, and the air was thick with hope. Clara and Victor were crowned, not as rulers, by blood, but by strength, by loyalty, and by love. And that night, beneath the same oak tree, they sealed their vow once more, not with words, but with passion, with every breath, every touch. The kingdom stood, unshaken, and they stood at its heart, together forever.